She shouldn't have been able to say those words. Not here, not now. The glass doors of the Harrington Global Medical Center penthouse suite slid open with a soft mechanical whisper as winter light poured across polished marble floors, reflecting the calm perfection of a world carefully built to never break. Inside, William Harrington stood at the head of a long conference table surrounded by executives and legal advisors, his voice steady as he finalized a merger that would reshape two major healthcare networks across the United States. On the table sat a leather folder, a fountain pen, and a glass of untouched mineral water, each placed with exact precision, as if even the smallest detail in his life had to obey control. No one noticed the small figure standing near the entrance at first, because children like Maya Brooks were not supposed to exist in rooms like this. She was 8 years old, wearing a faded navy jacket 2 sizes too large, her hair neatly braided but slightly frayed at the ends, her shoes quiet against the stone floor as she stepped forward with a courage that didn't match her size. The security guard moved to intercept her, but she lifted her hand just slightly, not in fear, but in certainty, and said nothing until she reached the edge of the table where William finally noticed her reflection in the glass surface. The room slowed without explanation, conversations thinning into silence as if the air itself had decided to pause. William frowned slightly, not in anger but in confusion, because this was not a place where interruptions were allowed, especially not from children. "How did you get in here?" he asked calmly, signaling for security to hold back, his tone controlled, practiced, the voice of a man used to managing chaos without letting it touch him. Maya didn't answer the question. Instead, she looked directly at him, her eyes steady in a way that made the room feel suddenly smaller, and she said softly, "Your daughter is still alive." The words did not belong in the room. They did not belong in reality, as William understood it. For a moment, nothing moved. Even the air seemed to lose its rhythm. Then a faint sound broke the silence. The subtle clink of a pen being set down too hard, the smallest betrayal of control. William's expression shifted, not into belief, but into instinctive denial. "That's not possible," he said immediately, voice lower now, as if volume could correct reality. A few executives exchanged glances, uncomfortable, assuming this was some kind of misunderstanding or attention-seeking fantasy. But Maya did not step back. She reached into her small bag and placed a thin object onto the table, sliding it across the polished surface until it stopped directly in front of him. It was a delicate bracelet, slightly worn, with a small engraved charm that caught the light just enough to make William's breath hesitate for the first time. His eyes locked onto it, and something behind them changed, not fully breaking, but cracking just enough to let something long buried rise toward the surface. The room did not speak. No one dared, because they had never seen William Harrington look uncertain. Not in boardrooms, not in courtrooms, not even in the aftermath of his personal tragedy 5 years earlier when his daughter Sophie had been declared lost after a sudden and unresolved disappearance that the world had eventually stopped talking about. Yet now, his hand hovered above the bracelet without touching it, as if contact might confirm something he had spent years refusing to imagine. Maya's voice remained calm, almost careful, but unshaken. "She didn't disappear," she said. "She was taken." The words landed differently than before, not as accusation, but as correction. William slowly leaned forward, eyes narrowing, as if trying to see through the object instead of at it. For a brief moment, the entire room felt suspended between two realities, the one where Sophie was gone forever, and the one where she had been somewhere else this whole time. A faint memory surfaced uninvited in William's mind, a fragment of a hospital corridor, a small laugh echoing near a white curtain, a moment he had convinced himself meant nothing. His breathing slowed, not from calmness, but from the weight of something he could no longer dismiss. Maya watched him carefully, not with pity, but with quiet certainty, as if she had already lived through the moment he was only now entering. And then, just as he reached for the bracelet, as if crossing an invisible line between denial and truth, the glass doors at the far end of the room opened again, letting in a cold rush of air that shifted everything once more. The moment the glass doors opened again, the atmosphere in the room shifted, as if a new current of air had carried in something unseen but undeniable, and William Harrington slowly turned his head, still processing the object on the table, still caught between disbelief and recognition. As his chief assistant stepped forward with careful hesitation and said there was an urgent call waiting from the legal department regarding the merger timeline, but William did not respond immediately because his attention remained locked on the small bracelet resting on the polished surface, its worn edges and delicate charm pulling at something buried deep beneath years of controlled silence. Maya Brooks did not move. She simply stood where she was, watching him with a stillness that felt far too mature for her age, as if she already understood that truth does not arrive all at once, but in layers that the human mind must be willing to accept. One of the executives shifted uncomfortably and attempted to speak, suggesting that perhaps the child should be escorted out to avoid further disruption. But William raised his hand without looking away from the bracelet, silencing the room in a way that was softer than command but heavier than authority. He finally exhaled, a slow and uneven breath, and asked Maya where she had gotten it, his voice lower now, no longer defensive but careful, as though any sudden movement in tone might break something fragile between them. Maya answered without hesitation, saying she did not take it from anyone. She received it from someone who could no longer keep it safe. And at that response, William's jaw tightened slightly, because the phrasing did not feel like imagination. It felt like memory trying to surface through water. The assistant stepped closer and quietly mentioned that security could remove the child if needed, but William again did not respond. Instead, leaning slightly forward until his hands rested near the edge of the table, his gaze now fully anchored on Maya for the first time, not as an interruption, but as a source of information he could no longer ignore. "Tell me exactly what you know," he said, and the room seemed to contract around those words, because William Harrington did not ask questions like that lightly, especially not in front of people who had spent years believing he had already accepted the loss of his daughter Sophie Harrington. Maya took a small breath and explained in simple, steady terms that Sophie had not disappeared the way the official report suggested, that there had been movement, relocation, and a change of identity. And as she spoke, William's expression shifted subtly between resistance and attention, as if each sentence was testing the foundation of what he believed to be settled truth. A few executives exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they were witnessing manipulation or something far more serious. But William lifted his hand again, signaling silence, and the room obeyed. He asked Maya how she could possibly know this, and for the first time she looked down briefly, not out of fear, but as if recalling something she had carried alone for too long, then said she had seen Sophie with her own eyes not long ago, under a different name, in a place far from here where no one was looking for her anymore. The words landed heavily, and William's breath caught for a fraction of a second before he masked it with controlled stillness, though his fingers tightened slightly against the table edge, betraying the strain beneath his composure. The assistant tried once more to intervene, suggesting that this conversation was inappropriate without verification, but William cut him off with a single quiet instruction to step outside, and for the first time in years, his authority did not feel like dominance, but like urgency shaped by fear he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. When the room finally quieted again, William leaned back slightly, eyes still fixed on Maya, and asked her to describe what she had seen in detail, every piece of it, no matter how small. Maya began to speak again, describing fragments of a life that did not match the official narrative, mentioning a school registration under a different surname, a medical record that carried familiar details, and a memory only Sophie could have known. And with each detail, William's certainty began to fracture in quiet, almost invisible ways. The bracelet on the table no longer felt like an object. It felt like a key that had been waiting far too long to be found. Outside the glass walls of the penthouse suite, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that inside this room a man was beginning to question the final truth he had accepted for 5 years. And as Maya finished speaking, she simply said again, softly but firmly, that Sophie was still alive, waiting somewhere for someone to finally look in the right direction. The silence that followed Maya Brooks's last words did not feel empty. It felt heavy, as if the air itself had absorbed everything that had just been said and refused to release it back into the room. And William Harrington remained seated at the head of the conference table, his eyes fixed on the small bracelet as though it had become something far larger than jewelry. something that carried weight beyond its physical form. For several seconds, no one in the room moved. Not the executives, not the assistants, not even the security staff standing near the glass entrance. Because the shift happening in William Harrington's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The kind of change that happens when a person begins to question something they have built their entire reality upon. He finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before, asking Maya to repeat exactly what she had seen, not as a demand but as a need. And Maya nodded once before continuing with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room, explaining that Sophie Harrington had been seen in a coastal town 2 states away, approximately 420 miles from the city, living under a different identity, attending a small private learning center that did not appear in public directories. One of the executives attempted to interrupt again, suggesting that such claims were impossible without verified documentation, but William did not look at him, instead instructing everyone to remain silent while he listened, and the executive immediately stopped speaking. Maya continued, describing how she had recognized Sophie not from official records, but from small details that could not be easily fabricated: a habit of holding her left wrist slightly higher when nervous, a faint scar near her thumb from a childhood incident, and a very specific phrase she used when unsure of something. Details that caused William's breathing to slow in a way that suggested recognition rather than disbelief. He stood up slowly from his chair, finally breaking his stillness, and walked toward the large window that overlooked the city skyline, placing one hand against the glass as if grounding himself in something physical while his mind processed what he was hearing. Behind him, the room remained frozen in uncertainty, but Maya did not move or follow. She simply waited, as if she understood that truth requires time to settle before it can be accepted. William asked her how she had come to know Sophie personally, and Maya hesitated for the first time, then explained that she had met her while staying temporarily at a community outreach program after being relocated from foster placement, and that Sophie had been using a different name but had never fully let go of who she was. The words carried a quiet impact, not dramatic, but steady, and William closed his eyes briefly as if trying to reconcile the image in his mind with the official record he had lived with for 5 years. He turned back toward the table and asked Maya if she had any proof, anything physical or digital that could confirm what she was saying, and Maya carefully placed a second item on the table, a folded piece of paper with a handwritten note that she said Sophie had written during a supervised activity, a note that included a personal phrase only Sophie and William would recognize. William stared at it for several seconds before touching it, his hand hesitating slightly before finally unfolding it, and as his eyes scanned the writing, something inside him shifted in a way that was no longer controlled, because the handwriting, the phrasing, and the subtle emotional tone matched memories he had long buried. A quiet breath escaped him, and for the first time since Maya had spoken, he did not immediately reject the possibility, instead asking where Sophie was now. And Maya responded that Sophie was still within reach, but being kept distant by circumstances that had not yet been fully uncovered. At that moment, William's assistant re-entered the room cautiously, holding a tablet and informing him that there was an updated report from an independent verification service regarding old missing person data associated with Sophie Harrington, and William turned toward him slowly, signaling him to continue. As the assistant read the summary aloud, confirming inconsistencies in the original disappearance documentation and noting gaps in surveillance records from that time period, William's posture changed, not dramatically, but enough for those watching to recognize that certainty was no longer his foundation. Maya remained still, her presence quiet but unwavering, and when William finally spoke again, his voice carried something unfamiliar, not authority, not control, but a fragile willingness to believe that what he had accepted as final might not have been the end at all. The updated report on the tablet did not make a sound as it loaded, but in the silence of the conference room it felt louder than anything spoken so far, and William Harrington stood motionless as the assistant read the verified summary line by line, confirming that several historical records connected to Sophie Harrington's disappearance contained inconsistencies that had never been publicly addressed, including mismatched timestamps, missing security footage intervals of approximately 47 minutes, and a delayed reporting sequence that did not align with standard emergency procedures. The words did not feel like accusations, yet they reshaped the atmosphere in the room into something far more unstable, because every sentence suggested not an absence of truth, but the presence of something that had been hidden within structured systems that were supposed to be reliable. William slowly turned back toward Maya Brooks, his expression no longer purely skeptical nor fully convinced, but suspended in a state of controlled uncertainty, as if every belief he had held for 5 years had been placed under review in a single afternoon. Maya did not step forward this time. She simply remained where she stood, hands loosely clasped in front of her, watching him with a calm that did not ask for validation, only acknowledgement. One of the senior advisors cautiously asked whether the investigation should be escalated to external legal authorities, but William raised a hand again without looking at him, signaling that the discussion would continue internally for the moment. He then asked Maya a question that changed the tone of the room, not about evidence, but about access, asking how a child like her had been able to reach information that had remained sealed for years, and Maya answered that she did not access anything directly. She only followed patterns that adults overlooked, connections between people, places, and repeated inconsistencies that no one had taken the time to align. The explanation was simple, but it carried an uncomfortable weight, because it implied that the truth had not been deeply hidden, only ignored. William returned to his seat slowly, as if the act of sitting required more effort than standing, and placed both hands on the table near the bracelet and the folded note, looking at them as if they now belonged to a larger system of meaning that was still forming in real time. He asked the assistant to cross-check the updated findings with private records from the Harrington Family Foundation archives, and within minutes the assistant confirmed another irregularity, a temporary relocation file linked to Sophie Harrington that had been marked as closed without final verification signatures. The room reacted with subtle shifts, small movements of discomfort, and exchanged glances, but William remained focused, his attention narrowing rather than expanding, as if clarity was emerging not from certainty, but from contradiction. Maya finally spoke again, her voice quiet but steady, saying that Sophie had never stopped trying to be found, but that the channels meant to reconnect her had been repeatedly interrupted by decisions made far above her control, decisions that she herself did not fully understand, but had observed indirectly through conversations and repeated relocations. William listened without interruption, and for the first time he did not immediately challenge the logic of what he was hearing, instead asking what Sophie had been like when Maya met her, not as a verification question, but as a human one. Maya's expression softened slightly as she described Sophie not as a missing figure from a report, but as someone who still remembered small personal details from her early childhood, including a preference for drawing near windows and a habit of finishing sentences softly when unsure if she was allowed to speak freely. As these details were spoken, William's composure shifted again, not breaking outwardly, but tightening inwardly as memory and possibility began to overlap. He looked down at the bracelet once more, then at the handwritten note, and finally said something he had not said since the day Sophie was declared gone, asking if there was any possibility at all that what Maya was describing could be confirmed in person. The assistant hesitated before answering, then stated that a live location trace connected to the latest unofficial sighting report could be initiated within hours if approved. William did not respond immediately, because the decision was no longer administrative. It was personal in a way he had avoided for years. Maya took a small step closer for the first time since the conversation began, not to pressure him, but simply to ensure he understood what she had already accepted as real. The room remained silent, waiting not for instruction, but for the moment when belief would either fully form or completely collapse, and William Harrington, for the first time in a long time, did not choose certainty. He chose the possibility that the truth had not ended, only been delayed. The decision did not arrive as a dramatic announcement or a sudden command, but as a quiet shift in William Harrington's posture, as if something inside him had finally stopped, resisting the weight of possibility and allowed it to move forward. He stood from the conference table again, this time not to observe or question, but to act, and the entire room seemed to adjust to that change instantly, because when a man like William Harrington moved with intention, everything around him followed. He instructed his assistant to initiate the live location trace immediately using the verified fragments from the updated report, including the irregular relocation file and the last unofficial sighting record connected to Sophie Harrington, and then added that all internal communications regarding the matter were to be restricted to his direct approval only. Maya Brooks watched without speaking, her small hands still folded, her presence steady in a way that contrasted with the quiet urgency forming around her. Within minutes, the assistant confirmed that the trace had been initiated and that preliminary coordinates would be available soon, narrowing the search to a coastal region approximately 2 states away, consistent with the fragmented information Maya had originally described. William did not sit back down. Instead, he picked up the bracelet once more, turning it slowly between his fingers as if it had become a physical anchor to a reality he had long refused to revisit. The executives in the room remained silent, unsure whether to remain or leave, until William finally dismissed them with a simple gesture, signaling that the meeting had ended without further discussion. As they filed out, the atmosphere in the penthouse suite shifted from corporate precision to something far more personal, almost fragile, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the emotional weight of what had just been uncovered. When the last executive left and the doors closed, William turned toward Maya fully for the first time since the conversation began, studying her not as an interruption, but as the unexpected origin point of a truth he could no longer dismiss. He asked her if she was certain she could identify the place again if they went there, and Maya nodded once, explaining that she remembered the environment clearly, not because it was remarkable, but because Sophie had described it as temporary and unfinished, a place people passed through rather than stayed in. William absorbed that information without interruption, then instructed his assistant to prepare transportation immediately, including a private vehicle and a secure travel route to the verified location, approximately 240 miles away, estimating a travel time of just under 4 hours depending on traffic conditions. As preparations began, the penthouse suite transformed from a static corporate space into a point of departure, with staff moving efficiently but quietly, aware that what was happening did not belong to any scheduled agenda. Maya remained near the table, her eyes occasionally shifting toward the bracelet, as if she understood its importance not as jewelry, but as connection. William approached her again, lowering his voice slightly, and asked if she was afraid of what they might find when they arrived. But Maya answered honestly that she was not afraid of the truth itself, only of it being ignored once more. That answer lingered longer than expected, because it reflected something William recognized in himself but had not named in years. When the car arrived at the building entrance, a black vehicle with tinted windows and a quiet engine designed for discretion rather than display, William guided Maya toward it personally, an action that surprised even his assistant, who followed closely with the remaining documents and devices. As they stepped into the elevator descending from the penthouse, the silence between them was no longer heavy, but focused, as if every unanswered question had temporarily aligned toward a single destination. Maya finally spoke again, asking if Sophie would remember her, and William paused before answering, saying he did not know what Sophie remembered, but he knew that memory had a way of surviving longer than certainty. The elevator doors opened directly into the private departure level, where the car was waiting, and as they entered, William looked out briefly at the city skyline stretching across the horizon, realizing that everything he had built, controlled, and maintained had brought him to this exact moment of uncertainty. Maya sat quietly beside him in the back seat, holding her small bag close, while William placed the bracelet carefully in a secure compartment between them, no longer as evidence, but as direction. As the car pulled away from the building and merged into the flow of traffic, the city lights began to blur slightly through the tinted glass, and William Harrington, for the first time in 5 years, was no longer moving away from the past, but directly toward it. The drive from the city did not feel like a simple transfer of distance. It felt like a gradual removal from everything William Harrington had built his life around, as the black vehicle moved steadily through highways and suburban stretches where the architecture slowly shifted from glass towers to low residential buildings, and then into quieter coastal roads. And inside the car, the silence was no longer uncomfortable but concentrated, as if every mile was compressing time itself into something unavoidable. Maya Brooks sat quietly in the back seat, her small hands resting on her lap, occasionally glancing out the window, but never speaking unless necessary. While William Harrington remained forward-facing, his posture controlled, but his attention divided between the road ahead and the unfolding coordinates being updated on the encrypted tablet held by his assistant in the front passenger seat. The live trace had narrowed further during the first hour of travel, confirming proximity to a small coastal town with a population of just under 12,000 people, a location that did not appear in any of William's previous investigations, which made its sudden relevance feel both precise and unsettling. As they passed the final highway exit, the environment changed again, the air visibly lighter, the horizon opening toward the ocean, and William noticed that Maya's gaze became more focused, as if she recognized something familiar in the landscape. The assistant quietly informed them that the last verified data point placed Sophie Harrington within a radius of approximately 3 miles from their current position, based on a combination of outdated administrative records and a recent anonymous confirmation tied to a local support facility. William did not respond immediately, but his hand tightened slightly around the edge of the seat as the vehicle turned into a narrower road lined with weathered buildings and small businesses that suggested a community far removed from the corporate environments he was accustomed to. After several minutes, the car slowed near a modest structure labeled as a community assistance center, its exterior simple and unremarkable, with a small parking lot that appeared partially filled. Maya leaned forward slightly as the vehicle came to a stop, her eyes scanning the entrance with quiet recognition, and she said softly that this was the place she had remembered, not because it was permanent, but because it was where she had last seen Sophie being guided inside by staff members who treated her as someone in transition rather than someone lost. William stepped out of the car first, followed closely by Maya and the assistant, and for a brief moment he stood still in front of the building, taking in its simplicity compared to the magnitude of what it now represented. The entrance door opened automatically as they approached, and inside, the environment was calm, with soft lighting and minimal noise, a space designed for support rather than attention. A staff member approached them cautiously, recognizing William Harrington only after a brief pause, and asked how they could assist, while William responded with controlled urgency, requesting information regarding any current residents or participants matching the name Sophie Harrington or any verified aliases linked to her case. The staff member hesitated, then guided them toward a small office area, explaining that while records were confidential, there had been a recent request to confirm identity for a young individual who had been under long-term transitional care, though no public disclosures had been made. At that statement, William's breathing slowed slightly, not from relief, but from the realization that confirmation might be closer than he had allowed himself to believe. Maya remained close behind him as they entered the office, and for the first time since the journey began, she reached out slightly and touched the edge of his sleeve, not to guide him, but to steady him. The staff member returned with a thin folder and placed it on the desk, explaining that the individual in question had been using a different name for protection purposes and that verification procedures were still ongoing due to the sensitive nature of the case. William opened the folder slowly, his eyes scanning the documents, and when he reached the section containing a recent photograph taken for internal records, his entire expression changed, not dramatically, but completely, as recognition replaced uncertainty in a single moment. The assistant stepped closer but did not speak, and Maya remained still, watching his reaction carefully. William stared at the image for several seconds without moving, as if confirming that what he was seeing was not a fragment of memory, but a present reality that had finally aligned with truth. His voice, when it came, was quiet and unsteady as he asked where she was currently located, and the staff member replied that she was in a nearby secured residence under supervised care, approximately 10 minutes from their location. At that moment, William closed the folder gently, as if afraid that any sudden movement might disrupt the reality forming in front of him, and he turned toward the door without hesitation, signaling that they would leave immediately. Maya followed closely, her steps matching his pace, while the assistant gathered the remaining documents in silence. As they exited the building and returned to the vehicle, William paused briefly at the entrance, looking once more at the quiet surroundings, realizing that the distance he had traveled was not only geographical, but emotional, leading him directly to the threshold of a truth that had waited 5 years to be acknowledged. Without speaking, he entered the car, and as the door closed behind him, the vehicle began moving again toward the final confirmed location where Sophie Harrington was waiting just beyond the next stretch of road. The vehicle slowed as it approached the final stretch of road, where the coastal air grew clearer and the sound of distant waves replaced the steady hum of highways, and William Harrington sat in silence, his eyes fixed forward, but his mind fully occupied with the realization that in a matter of minutes he would be facing something he had convinced himself no longer existed. Maya Brooks remained still in the back seat, her small frame leaning slightly toward the window, her attention drawn to the changing environment as the car passed a row of modest homes and then turned toward a narrow driveway marked only by a simple sign indicating a supervised residential care facility. The assistant in the front seat confirmed softly that this was the final verified location tied to Sophie Harrington's current record, and that all previous data points had converged here within the last 72 hours through cross-referenced administrative updates and local confirmations. William did not respond, but his hand moved slightly toward the door handle as the vehicle came to a stop, signaling an instinctive readiness that contrasted sharply with the controlled composure he had maintained throughout the journey. The driver opened the door, and the three of them stepped out into a quiet environment where the sound of the ocean was now fully present, steady and distant, as if marking time itself in the background of what was about to unfold. The building in front of them was smaller than William had expected, a two-story residential structure with clean but simple architecture, surrounded by a small garden area and a fence perimeter that suggested care rather than confinement. A staff member was already waiting near the entrance, having been notified of their arrival, and approached with careful professionalism, confirming William Harrington's identity before guiding them inside without delay. The interior was calm, softly lit, and designed to feel safe rather than institutional, with a quiet reception area and a hallway leading toward private rooms where residents could maintain privacy during recovery or transition periods. As they walked through the corridor, William's pace slowed slightly, not from hesitation but from the growing awareness that each step was bringing him closer to a moment that would define everything that had brought him here. Maya walked just ahead of him now, not speaking, but clearly following something only she understood, her presence steady and focused. The staff member stopped near a closed door at the end of the hallway and informed them that the individual they were seeking was currently inside, and that any interaction should proceed with care and patience due to the emotional sensitivity of the situation. William nodded once, though his attention was already fixed on the door, his breathing measured but no longer fully controlled. For a moment, no one moved, and the silence in the hallway felt heavier than any conversation that had taken place before. Then Maya stepped slightly closer to William, looked up at him, and said quietly that Sophie would recognize him even if she did not show it immediately, because memory often reacts before words can catch up. William did not answer, but his expression shifted subtly, acknowledging the possibility without fully accepting it. The staff member gently opened the door and stepped aside, allowing them to enter first. The room beyond was softly illuminated by natural light coming through a wide window that faced the coast, and near that window stood a young girl, slightly older than Maya, holding a sketchbook in her hands and looking out toward the horizon. She turned slowly when the door opened, her movements calm but cautious, as if she was used to observing before engaging. For a brief moment, no one spoke, and the space between them filled with a stillness that carried more meaning than words. William stepped forward slowly, his eyes locked on her face, searching for recognition in every detail, every expression, every pause in her movement. The girl's gaze shifted toward him, then briefly toward Maya, and something in her posture changed, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that something familiar had been interrupted. William stopped a few feet away, unable to move closer, and simply said her name softly, as if speaking it might confirm or undo everything at once. Sophie Harrington remained still, her eyes studying him carefully, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was the distant ocean beyond the window, steady and unchanging. Maya stood quietly between them at a distance, her role no longer to reveal, but to witness, as the truth she had carried finally reached the moment it had been moving toward all along. The room did not move after Sophie Harrington turned around, as if even time itself had decided to pause at the threshold of something irreversible, and William Harrington remained standing just a few feet inside the doorway, his eyes fixed on her face with a mixture of recognition, disbelief, and a silence so deep it felt heavier than any words he could form. Sophie held her sketchbook slightly tighter against her chest, her posture cautious but not fearful, as if she had learned over time how to remain steady in moments where the world did not explain itself clearly. Maya Brooks stood quietly near the side of the room, her gaze moving between them, not intervening anymore, only observing the moment she had carried across distance, uncertainty, and years of hidden truth. William finally took a small step forward, then stopped again, as if the space between them carried a weight that required permission rather than motion, and he spoke her name once more, softer this time, not as a question, but as something carefully returned to the world after being lost. Sophie did not respond immediately, but her eyes narrowed slightly, not in rejection, but in the careful way memory begins to surface when confronted with something familiar but incomplete. The staff member who had guided them and remained near the doorway, silent and respectful, understanding that what was unfolding was not procedural but deeply personal. William slowly lowered his hands, no longer holding anything, as if to signal that he came without authority, without expectation, only presence, and he told Sophie that he had been searching for her for a very long time. Though the words felt inadequate the moment they left his mouth. Sophie looked down briefly at her sketchbook, then back up at him, and asked in a calm but uncertain voice who had told him she was here, as if the idea of being found was still something she had not fully prepared to accept. Maya stepped forward slightly at that moment, not to interrupt, but to clarify with quiet honesty that no one had told them directly, only that patterns and fragments of information had eventually led them here, piece by piece, until everything aligned in a way that could no longer be ignored. Sophie's expression shifted subtly at that explanation, and she took a small step backward toward the window, as if needing space to process the presence in front of her. William noticed immediately and stopped moving entirely, respecting the distance, and said that he did not want to overwhelm her, only to understand what had happened and why she was no longer where he thought she had been. For a brief moment, Sophie's eyes softened, and she looked out toward the ocean beyond the glass, as if gathering thoughts that had been shaped by years of separation and silence. She then asked a question that carried both innocence and weight, asking whether he still remembered the day she disappeared, and the room seemed to tighten again around those words, because they carried a past that none of them could change. William's response was immediate but unsteady, saying that he had never stopped remembering, even when he was forced to accept what others had concluded, and his voice carried a quiet strain that suggested the years had never fully resolved that moment for him. Sophie listened carefully, her expression still guarded, but no longer entirely distant, and she asked why it had taken so long for anyone to come looking in the right way. William paused, unable to answer immediately, because the truth was not simple enough to compress into a single explanation, and instead he admitted that he had trusted systems and reports that were meant to be final, believing that certainty was the same as truth. Maya looked down briefly at that statement, as if recognizing the flaw in that assumption more clearly than anyone else in the room. Sophie shifted slightly closer to the window again, then looked back at William and said quietly that she had not been gone in the way people believed, only moved through places where she was never fully identified as herself, and that over time she had learned to live between names rather than within one. William took a slow breath, absorbing that reality not as data but as lived experience, and asked her if she ever wanted to be found during that time. And Sophie hesitated before answering that she had stopped expecting it, not because she no longer wanted it, but because expectation itself had become something too heavy to carry. The silence that followed was different from before, no longer filled with uncertainty alone, but with the fragile beginning of understanding that neither side could fully explain what the other had endured. Maya stepped back again, returning to her quiet place near the wall, as if her role had reached its natural conclusion, and the room now belonged entirely to the two people whose separation had defined everything leading up to this moment. William finally spoke again, not asking for forgiveness, not asking for return, but simply saying that he was there now, and would remain there as long as she would allow it. And Sophie did not respond immediately, but she did not turn away either, as the distance between them remained unclosed but no longer unreachable. The silence inside the coastal residence did not break immediately after William Harrington's final words. Instead, it settled into a deeper stillness, one that felt less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something finally being acknowledged after years of denial. And Sophie Harrington stood near the window, holding her sketchbook loosely now, as if the tension that had defined her posture moments earlier had begun to soften under the weight of recognition that did not require proof, only presence. William remained where he was, no longer attempting to close the distance, because something in Sophie's expression told him that movement too quickly might undo what fragile alignment had just formed between them. Maya Brooks stood slightly behind and to the side, watching quietly, her role no longer active but complete, as though the path she had followed had ended exactly where it was always meant to. Sophie finally spoke again, her voice lower than before, asking William not for explanation but for honesty, asking what he believed had happened during all the years he thought she was gone, and the question carried a weight that could not be answered with facts alone. William looked down briefly, then admitted that he had built an understanding of loss based on incomplete information, and that over time he had allowed that version of reality to harden into certainty because it was easier than confronting the unknown. Sophie listened without interruption, her fingers lightly touching the edge of her sketchbook, and when she responded, she said that certainty had never reached her where she was, only fragments of it, only moments where she felt remembered but not found. The words created a quiet shift in the room, because they revealed not absence, but continuity, a life that had continued outside the boundaries of the narrative William had accepted. Maya took a small step back toward the door, sensing that what followed was no longer about discovery, but about rebuilding what discovery had revealed. William finally lowered himself into the chair near the table, not as a collapse, but as an act of grounding, as if his body needed to catch up with what his mind had already begun to accept. He asked Sophie if she remembered anything about the day everything changed, but he framed the question carefully, not as investigation, but as shared memory. Sophie hesitated, then said she remembered confusion more than clarity, people moving quickly, instructions she did not fully understand, and then a long period where everything familiar became distant but not entirely gone. Her voice remained steady, but there was a quiet emotional restraint in it, as if she had learned how to describe difficult things without reopening them fully. William closed his eyes briefly at her words, not from pain, but from recognition of the gap that had existed between their experiences of the same timeline. He told her that during that time he had believed she was no longer reachable, and that belief had shaped every decision he made afterward, including the systems he trusted and the distance he allowed himself to maintain from hope. Sophie looked at him more directly now and asked if he had ever considered that belief might not have been the same as truth, and the question lingered in the air longer than any answer he could immediately form. William admitted quietly that he had not questioned it enough, because questioning it would have required him to live in uncertainty, and uncertainty had felt like a place he could not function in at the time. The admission did not resolve anything, but it changed the emotional structure of the room, softening the boundary between past and present. Sophie took a small step away from the window, no longer retreating, but also not yet fully approaching, and said that she had learned to continue without expecting resolution, and that survival sometimes meant accepting incomplete understanding as a way of moving forward. William nodded slowly, acknowledging that truth without trying to correct it, and then said that he did not want her to continue alone anymore if she did not have to. The words were simple, but they carried a shift in intent that felt more permanent than anything spoken before. Maya, standing near the doorway now, looked between them one last time, her expression calm and distant in a way that suggested she understood her part in this moment was no longer required. Sophie glanced at Maya briefly and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, not as gratitude alone, but as recognition of the bridge that had been formed through her presence. William noticed that exchange and realized that the connection being rebuilt was not only between father and daughter, but between all three of them in different ways shaped by different forms of absence and return. Outside the window, the ocean continued its steady rhythm, unchanged by the human reconstruction taking place within the room. And as Sophie finally placed her sketchbook on the table instead of holding it, the space between her and William no longer felt like distance defined by loss, but like a gap that had begun, quietly and uncertainly, to close.